Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life.
Diddy walked into the courtroom with the heavy awareness that this was not just another legal proceeding. This was the day the narrative would be cemented, the day history would remember. He was no longer walking in as the music mogul who once dominated the charts, the businessman who redefined hip-hop entrepreneurship.
Will Sean Diddy Combs be released from jail? I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. The circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. Think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations, that's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arranged for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been...
Or the cultural figure who had been at the center of celebrity power circles for decades. Today, he was the defendant, a man awaiting judgment. The walk from the courthouse entrance to his seat at the defense table was short in distance, but it felt endless in weight. Every step echoed on the polished floor, reverberating through a room already thick with tension. There were no smiles, no friendly nods to the cameras, No forced displays of confidence, just the sound of leather shoes on tile and the subdued rustle of reporters shifting in their seats as they trained their eyes on him. The gallery was a patchwork of faces, some strangers, some recognizable industry figures who had come not to show support, but to witness history. Former associates, rivals, and curious onlookers filled the benches, each carrying their own quiet reasons for being there. Some wanted closure, others wanted spectacle, and many simply wanted to be able to say they had been in the room when it all came crashing down. Diddy sat at the defense table, flanked by his legal team. They whispered quietly to him, but he gave no visible reaction. His focus was locked on the judge's bench. It was as if he had already accepted that nothing said in those last few moments
Of a bail agreement when he's out of custody.
Right, right.
And I think that that chicken is coming home to roost again. I mean, I think that's what happened yesterday afternoon. That any judge who has a criminal defendant who behaves like that, that is an affront to the court itself. It's disrespectful to the
Sure.
court, and it's almost like he couldn't get out of his own way there at the beginning. But he had an excellent defense team.
He does. He does. So assuming for a moment, whenever the sentencing hearing happens, right? Let's say it happens in a month from now. Let's say it has October 3rd. The question is, what's his sentence? As we mentioned, the prosecution in a filing from yesterday talked about the guidelines range being 51 to 63 months. Now, this is before a pre-sentencing investigation and report. Now, the defense, right, they want 21 months. He's already served almost 10. Talk to us about what you're thinking here, because there is no minimum. The maximum's 10. If the judge were to combine it together, like you said, 20 years, feels highly unlikely that would happen. As we're taught, what is a pre-sentencing report investigation? How would it affect this? What do you think the judge is going to do? There's so many different factors to consider here. And it's not like a murder case when it's like, okay, we know what's going to happen. It's like life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's a given. There's room here. What do you think the judge is going to do?
So in federal court, this is actually very interesting. They rely very heavily on those pre-sentencing investigations. So essentially, what will happen is there'll be a federal probation officer, and they do these for almost every case, where they will do their own investigation, where they'll talk to family members, they'll talk to employers, they'll talk to neighbors, and they will make a recommendation to the court as to suitability for release, suitability for time. And that's something that federal judges traditionally really adhere to. They tend to put a lot of weight on those, far more than they do in state court. The probation department can make a recommendation, but the DA will certainly have more ability, most of the time, to talk a judge in or out of a sentencing recommendation from the probation department. Federal court is different. They really put a lot of weight on those. So that's something that I think is going to be very interesting. And a lot of that will come down to what the individuals involved in that investigation, even though it shouldn't impact their professional recommendation. It's really, I think we're going to see what they thought of the case. Did they think he got away with something horrific here? Did they think that he was getting railroaded from the beginning? I think that may reflect in the recommendation to the court. But of course, we don't know what that is yet. I don't know. If I'm his defense lawyer, I'm kind of I don't know if I am pressing the gas on that, trying to make this thing go faster. I mean, it's coming up. It's coming up soon enough anyway. I would want to give them the time and not press them, because you don't want a probation officer or anybody in the federal system to feel like they're being rushed.
Right.
Because I think it's very easy to just go,
Yeah.
okay, screw it, the guy should stay in.
The prosecution made
But
the point
that's just
yesterday.
me.
They said the point, like, we're not ready to give a really sentencing recommendation. We haven't gotten the report. There's people say, well, maybe he'll get time served, right? He's been locked up. There's other people say, no, the judge is going to throw the book at him. Even though the judge said yesterday, even though I'm denying him bail and I'm looking at certain conditions, this is not reflective or a preview of what my sentencing recommendation or what my sentence will be. But, are we looking at double digits? Are we looking, you think, at 1 to 5 years, time served? I know it's so impossible to ask, but it is a very specific
Yeah.
charges he was convicted of.
Yeah, we're not looking at double digits.
Okay.
I cannot imagine the court imposing that. And remember, because this law is so old, and we're in an age of Uber. So literally, somebody in New York City, a man or a woman who engages the services of a sex worker who lives in New Jersey, and if they pay for their Uber, that technically is a Mann Act violation. Okay, so it's a morality crime, and that it just does not carry the.
could change what was about to happen. His attorneys shuffled papers, adjusted their suits, and stole glances toward the prosecution table, where the opposing team sat ready, their case long prepared and sharpened to a fine point. The judge entered the room, their black robe flowing as they took their seat. The room rose in unison and then sat back down, the sound of chairs scraping the floor punctuating the silence. The judge's expression was unreadable, but their presence commanded attention. Years of high-profile trials had taught them how to maintain control of a room, and on this day, they needed every ounce of that control. They began by reviewing the charges. Their voice was steady, precise, and unhurried. The litany of accusations, evidence, and testimonies painted a picture that was both sprawling and damning. This was not the kind of case that hinged on a single witness or a single moment. This was a case built on patterns, on years of decisions that had accumulated into an unshakable narrative. The judge spoke of the public's perception versus the legal realities, reminding the court that while fame and influence can sometimes bend narratives in the outside world, they have no power within these walls.
To, attorney-client privilege
Sure, of
conversations, obviously he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news, some of the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made, but I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion, because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent? Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off. And I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of this particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been.
Every word was a brick being laid on the foundation of the decision that was about to be revealed. The defense shifted uncomfortably. The prosecution sat motionless, knowing they had done their work. Diddy's eyes remained fixed forward. His face was composed, but there was a subtle tension in the way his jawline tightened with each sentence. He knew that the next few minutes would define the rest of his life. No tour, no album, no brand deal could rewrite the judgment that was coming. This was beyond the reach of PR teams and lawyers. The judge's tone shifted. It was no longer the recitation of facts but the prelude to a decision. The room seemed to constrict as everyone leaned forward, their bodies reacting to the inevitability of the moment. The words came slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of the sentence required a careful delivery. When the length of the prison term was finally spoken, it landed in the room like a thunderclap. The numbers were long, longer than many had anticipated, long enough to wipe away any faint hope that Diddy might walk free in a matter of years. It was a sentence designed not just to punish, but to send a message.
That's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits, and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict does not is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he can say, look, I was once an abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR? So that way, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn or possibly a potential prison and just be like, you know what, I am.
Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some people closed their eyes, taking in the moment. Others scribbled furiously in notepads, knowing that every detail of this would be picked apart in headlines and broadcasts within minutes. The energy in the room shifted instantly, from tense anticipation to stunned reality. Diddy sat completely still. There was no outburst, no visible shock, no immediate protest. His stillness was almost eerie, as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind so many times that the reality no longer had the power to surprise him. His lawyers leaned in to whisper, but he didn't respond. He didn't move. It was only when the guards approached that he finally shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and turned toward the door that would take him into custody. It was a small act, but one that seemed loaded with meaning, perhaps a final attempt to hold on to dignity in a moment when everything else had been stripped away. The walk toward the exit was silent except for the low murmur of voices in the gallery.
Victims in this trial, but there were little points that were brought up in terms of like the civil matters, those including like Bonna and her civil claim, Dawn Richard and her civil claim. I think even during the cross-examination of Cassie, one of the defense attorneys, that would be Anna Esteval, she had asked, was the baby oil laced? And I was thinking back to the civil claims, because a lot of civil claims had, a lot of civil suits had claimed that
And it wasn't laced.
That it was, or yeah, the civil suits claimed it was laced, but then in the criminal trial, Cassie had confirmed that the baby oil was never laced with any type of narcotics or anything like that.
By the way, Combs' legal team said in a statement to Page 6, quote, Mr. Combs' trial and acquittal on trafficking and RICO charges proves what we have been saying all along. Mr. Combs never sexually assaulted or trafficked anyone. That people continue to broadcast and file false accusations, no matter how heinous and uncorroborated, is unfortunate. But Mr. Combs will not back down. He will fight for as long as necessary to win his full vindication. I talked about it on a previous sidebar how he might tackle all these lawsuits, maybe motions to dismiss, maybe try to say, you know, these Jane and John Doe shouldn't proceed under pseudonyms. If you can convince a court of that, they may be reluctant to continue the case if they have to expose their identities. He might try to get rid of them at initial stages as much as possible.
And he was successful at that at the beginning, too.
Yeah, a few of them, right?
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about the jurors, okay? So first, a juror has spoken out since the verdict. Not surprising, we had a feeling this would happen. This unnamed juror apparently spoke to ABC and said that the public reaction to this decision, quote, is highly insulting and belittling to the jury and the deliberation process. We spent over 2 days deliberating. Our decision was based solely on the evidence presented and how the law is stated. We would have treated any defendant in the same manner regardless of who they are. I have nothing else to say. Now, you watched the jury, okay? And we'll talk about what an alternate juror had to say too, but you watched the jury. You watched them day in and day out. What do you make of that statement?
I was a little surprised by that statement, just a little bit, only because, and I shouldn't say anything surprising to me when it comes to this trial, I found that statement surprising only because we clearly had heard the same evidence. Obviously, they saw a little bit more than I saw being inside the gallery. Some of the exhibits we weren't able to see, that sort, and that included, you know, the freak-off tapes, the hotel night tapes, all of that stuff. And so I was surprised by the jury's decision. It's mainly to count 2. Not as surprised.
Sex trafficking.
Yeah, sex trafficking to Cassie. Yeah, not really surprised with count 1 or even count 4 either.
So racketeering and sex trafficking.
Yeah, I know. I'm just naming the counts, not actually specifying them or anything. But I get also why the juror made that very pointed statement too, because given the backlash that this jury has faced, given that a lot of people were kind of upset with the jury's decision. I mean, again, we had heard the same evidence. They saw a little bit more than obviously I saw. And so I respect the jury's decision. They were able to deliberate. I was surprised that they didn't deliberate a little longer, I'll say that. But, you know, they're regular people, men and women, just like everybody else. And so the way they interpreted it is the way they interpreted it. And, you know, even though I'm surprised by their outcome, I'm not surprised also by that statement either.
When the juror says how the law is stated, see, that's what stood out to me. Because to me it says, hey, we couldn't imagine.
Some whispered in disbelief. Others spoke in hushed tones about the magnitude of what had just happened. The cameras outside the courtroom were already flashing as the news broke across television screens and social media feeds. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters shouting questions that would go unanswered. Microphones were thrust forward, cameras rolled, and commentators speculated wildly about what this meant for Diddy's legacy, his business empire, and the music industry as a whole. But inside, the echoes of the judge's words still hung in the air. For decades, Diddy had been a symbol of ambition, resilience, and power. He had navigated the industry with a combination of business acumen and sheer force of will. He had weathered scandals, rivalries, and public controversies that might have ended lesser careers. But none of that mattered now. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer the mogul or the icon, he was the convicted. The courtroom emptied slowly. People lingered in the aisles.
Is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but 3 warrant particular emphasis. 1, continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2, claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case, and 3, general issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a significant issue at the MDC related to the safety of employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action from multiple agencies to address. Importantly, MDC, as a jail, has a significant law enforcement presence within its walls 24 hours per day that are equipped with investigatory and often unregulated authority. Thus, the requirement of outside law enforcement agencies to ensure safety within the MDC is an admission that serious violence, mayhem, and chaos is occurring within the MDC that requires more than a Band-Aid raid, but rather surgery. Indeed, we are aware of ongoing threats of violence and actual violence in the facility such that Mr. Combs' safety is constantly at risk. And they go on to argue, though Mr. Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement, the violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement risk given the clear precedent of multiple similarly situated Mann Act convictions where defendants were released on conditions. Now, the government, by the way, would probably disagree with that statement of him being a model inmate. Remember when they accused Combs of trying to arrange three-way phone calls and buying the use of other inmates' phone privileges to try to make sure the government wasn't listening in, that he was having these private conversations, that he was allegedly trying to contact witnesses in the case, that he allegedly orchestrated a birthday campaign to help his public image while he was locked up. So if we hear a government response, I'm sure they're going to say something about that. Then the defense highlights he's not a risk of flight, he's not a danger to the community, which, by the way, I think are real key points here. But they seem to echo a lot of the same arguments that they have already stated to the court. And remember, they haven't been successful in the past. That he voluntarily came to New York last year to surrender himself to authorities, that he gave up his passport to his attorneys 6 months before his arrest, paid off his mortgage on his Miami home so it was free and clear for him to stay at while out on bond. He was just acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing, which, by the way, carried decades, if not life in prison, that he's not a risk of flight. That's the basic argument. Now, when it comes to the danger argument, that is key. Why? Judge Subramanian had said after the verdict that the reason he was denying bail was because of Combs' violence, that his own attorneys admitted he was violent during the course of the trial. Well, here is what Combs' defense attorneys are
willing to break the spell of what they had just witnessed. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a shocking turn in a story that had always seemed larger than life. And as the heavy wooden doors finally closed, one truth was clear: the empire had fallen. The man who once stood at the top of the music world now faced the reality of years, possibly decades, behind bars. No amount of wealth, influence, or reputation could reverse what had been decided in that room. The headlines would run for weeks, the debates would rage on, supporters would defend him, critics would condemn him, and the industry would quietly adjust to the absence of one of its most powerful figures. But the man at the center of it all would face the next chapter of his life not in boardrooms or studios, but in the confines of a prison cell. For Diddy, the collapse was total, and for those who watched it unfold, it was a moment they would never forget.